Hello and welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohen, speaking to you from the Drexel University Picture Gallery. This is the second part of a two-part interview with the Honorable Rudolph Giuliani, former mayor of New York City. Mr. Giuliani served as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York from 1983 to 1989. He was elected mayor of New York City from 1994 to 2001. And in 2008, he was a contender for the Republican Party's presidential nomination. In the first part of this interview, we discussed Mr. Giuliani's tenure as mayor, specifically his philosophy of leadership and how he reduced crime and made New York a more livable city. We also discussed his response to the 9/11 disaster. In this portion of the interview, we will discuss his thoughts on the future of the Republican Party, and we'll also touch on some aspects of his personal life. Rudolph Giuliani, Rudy, welcome to the Drexel interview.
Thank you very much.
Well, you went from being a Democrat, we've only spoken about you as a Republican, but you started your career as a Democrat, you became an independent briefly, and then you became a Republican.
Correct.
There have been many theories about this shift or evolution in your thinking. Could you explain it briefly for us?
I like to think of it as what Churchill said. Churchill used to say, if you're not a liberal when you're 20, you have no heart. And if you're not a conservative by the time you're 40, you have no brain.
Okay.
And so I went through an evolution, I'm not going to say like Churchill, kind of like Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan began as a Democrat, became a Republican. I was a Democrat when I grew up. Early part of my life, I was a Democrat. About 1972, I started to think that the Democratic Party had gone too left. George McGovern was the candidate of the party. I thought that George McGovern's position on communism was too weak.
But you voted for George McGovern.
I did,
yeah.
And after that I had misgivings about it. And I started thinking, I don't agree with them on foreign policy. I thought the social programs had become too big, too dependent, too mismanaged, maybe because I was an assistant U.S. attorney then, investigating corruption in New York City. I could see the corruption in the Model Cities administration, the corruption in the welfare programs. You could see that it was massive. It wasn't just individual. It was almost systemic in many of the programs. And it was leading into a second generation of dependency, which seemed to me that you were robbing people of the American dream. So I decided to change parties. I couldn't quite become a Republican because I thought of the Republicans. I grew up thinking they were the party of the rich. But I knew the Democratic Party was way off course, so I became an independent.
Yeah.
And then I went to work in Washington for Judge Tyler, met a lot of Republicans, got to know them. Big influence on my life was a person from Philadelphia, Jay Waldman, who was a federal judge here in Philadelphia. Jay and I worked together in the Justice Department. We used to talk a lot about politics, and he probably, more than anyone else, convinced me to become a Republican.
Okay, let me stop you there. You were from a family of Democrats, right?
Yes.
And I do want to read a quote that was attributed to your mother.
Right.
She said, he's definitely not a conservative Republican. He thinks he is, but he isn't. He still feels very sorry for the poor.
Well, my mom was a wonderful lady, and she was a great political thinker, but I hate to say she was wrong about that. Here's what she was wrong about it. Maybe she never made the full evolution. And that is the theory that Republican conservatives don't care about the poor. I used to think, as mayor of New York, that I cared more about the poor than the liberals did, because I actually tried to solve their problems, as opposed to make their problems worse. I'll give you an example. Homeless people. The general liberal theory about homeless people, at least in New York, is they have a right to live on the street. That's totally throwing a person away. You would never let your brother or sister live on the street. My idea of homelessness is that you engage people on the street. You get them off the street. You try and intervene in their lives, and you try to get them treatment, help, treatment for drug addiction, treatment for mental illness, or maybe a place to live, depending on the nature of their problem. But you don't just walk away from the problem. And the liberals have this wonderful notion of the underclass. It's a terrible idea.
Well,
the reality is the American solutions to problems work for the poor just like they do for the middle class and the rich. And what American liberalism had done is cut American poor off from those solutions.
Okay, I'm not going to quarrel with you there. I will ask you, though, I mean, the question of how conservative you have become is a question.
Right.
When you were mayor, the view was that you were a liberal Republican. You were moderate Republican to a liberal Republican. Now it seems that you've shifted. Would you say that's true? I mean, is this part of the evolution? When we talk about you moving from Democrat to Independent to Republican, are you also moving to the right?
I actually think when I was mayor, and if you read the New York Times editorials, they'll about 75 to 80% of the time they disagreed with me on the things that I did as mayor. I was a conservative, certainly on policing and law and order. I was conservative on economic policy, low taxes, less spending. I was moderate to liberal on social policy.
Right.
And I still am.
You were liberal on, say, illegal immigrants, on gay rights. I wonder how do you stand on those issues now?
I haven't changed at all on gay rights. Still believe in civil unions, still believe in protection against discrimination for people who are gay and lesbian, and still believe in marriage between a man and a woman. I guess the movement has gone further than I'm willing to go. That was the position I had when I was the mayor, the position I still have. Same thing on choice. I'm pro-choice, but I'm against abortion, which means, personally, I would prefer if a person didn't have an abortion. I wish our society never had abortion.
Has that position been a problem for you in the Republican Party?
Of course it has.
Is that a sticking point in particular for you?
Yeah.
Okay, but you stick by it.
It's one I stick by. I haven't changed my mind about it. I mean, I think that that's the right position. I think the right position for a person in public office is to have their personal views about it, but because people widely disagree about it, to allow them personal choice. And I think it's consistent with being a Republican who wants to get government out of people's lives.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess I'll shift here for a moment and talk about the fact that you are the product of a Catholic upbringing. Mm-hmm. You went to parochial schools, very formative, I would say. Do you feel, how do you reconcile
that was
those
very
ideas?
hard.
Yeah.
I mean, the Catholic Church, as a matter of doctrine and dogma, is anti-abortion, and I had a struggle with that. I had a struggle with that being in public office, and I thought about it a great deal. I talked to a lot of people about it, read about it a lot, and I came to the conclusion that the right position for me was personally opposed to abortion, but from the point of view of public office, let people make up their own mind about it, because people of conscience have two different views of it, and I didn't feel that I could impose my personal views on other people. I thought they have a right.
How do you feel about how Barack Obama has been handling this particular issue? Because he seems to be saying precisely what you have said.
I think he has pretty much the same position that I have, as do, believe it or not, many Republicans.
You don't hear it that often these days.
You don't, but when I was in office, the governor of New York was a Republican, George Pataki. He had the same position that I had. The governor of New Jersey was in office, Christie Whitman. She had the same position that I had. The governor of Massachusetts, Mitt Romney, had the same position that I had. Now, he changed his position, but he had the same position that I had.
What you're talking about, though, are people who were moderate Republicans.
Moderate. I think the confusion here is, at least the way people describe things, moderate on social policy.
Yeah.
But all of the people I just mentioned were quite conservative on economic policy and quite conservative on law and order, policing issues. I was the instigator of workfare in New York City. I mean, I required people who were getting welfare to go to work, and reduced the welfare rolls by 400,000, 500,000, 600,000 people. So from the point of view of economic policy, I was always a conservative. From the point of view of social policy, you could call me, I think, a moderate. Some people say I was a liberal, but I think I was a moderate.
Okay, all right, I'll grant you that. Let's talk about your attempt to win the Republican nomination for 2008. Do you ever think about what might have been? Had you won that nomination,
I thought you meant what could I have done differently? I've got about 100 of those things.
Those are two
I've got about 100 of those things.
But I think more interesting is the question, if you had won the nomination, do you think then the outcome might have been different?
One never knows. I have a sense, and I've said this to John McCain, and I said it recently, just the other day, to another Republican. I think with the economic crisis that took place, it might have been very hard for any Republican to get elected, whether it was me or Mitt Romney or anyone else. I think that kind of determined the election. Who knows? Maybe not. Maybe somebody that articulated something slightly different or whatever. But I think John McCain, without that, could have won the election. In fact, until the economic crisis started, John McCain was ahead.
You don't
4 or
think
5
his
points.
choice of a vice presidential candidate hurt him?
Until the economic crisis, that choice actually helped him. And it was the strangest thing, but I spoke at the convention right before Sarah Palin. And she came out and speak right after me. And when we left the convention, we were ahead by 4 or 5%, the party was, and the ticket was, and she had created quite a bit of excitement. I think that the determining factor in the election was the economic crisis. All of a sudden, everybody started voting just on the economy. And it was very, very hard to be part of the party in power, trying to maintain the presidency with all that going on.
Okay, what's your feeling about Barack Obama, and both as an individual or as a character, his character, and as in terms of his policy right now?
Well, as far as his character and personality is concerned, I'm very impressed with him, as everyone else is. I think he's a fine person. I think his achievement is historic, something that all Americans can be proud of. On his policies, I'm disappointed in his policies. I thought he would be more practical than he has turned out to be, both with regard to the economy and with regard to handling terrorism. With regard to the economy, I think he's made fundamental mistakes that are going to cost us dearly in the future. I think he's not just spending too much money, he's spending amounts of money we've never spent before in the wake of a recession. The answer to a recession is lowering government spending, reducing taxes so that you put more emphasis on growth of the private sector, not building up this huge government. The problem with, whether you agree with it or not philosophically, the problem with it is, unless some miracle occurs, it's going to create tremendous inflation. Yeah. You've got to pay for this. You can't add $1.5 trillion in spending to a government that was already spending too much money and not expect that the only way the government can pay for it is to print money. Our economy is never going to grow at the rates that would absorb that kind of inflation. So I think he's leaving a tremendous burden for the future of the American economy, which didn't have to be. I came into office in a recession. I came into office with a $2.3 billion deficit. I came into office with 11% unemployment. It's not 8% now. And I did exactly the opposite. I lowered spending, and I lowered taxes, and it worked. And I think that the choices that were made were a terrible mistake. And I had hoped that when he got into office, some of the ideology that he was talking about during the campaign, he would have moderated. And in fact, it seems to me he's gone more in the other direction. Now, maybe Congress got control of the agenda. Thought it was a mistake that he allowed Congress to do the first stimulus package and not present one of his own. When I came into office, I worked night and day before I got into office to construct my own plan so I can superimpose it on the legislature. Instead, he allowed Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, to kind of develop that stimulus plan. And that stimulus plan was a massive pork bill. It was was it 800 billion or 700 billion? I can say this from a position of strength. I faced something similar and did exactly the opposite, and it worked. I faced 11% unemployment, a $2.3 billion deficit, which is roughly the proportion that exists right now in New York, and I did exactly the opposite.
You were a master of, well, media manipulation. Is that right to say? You were very aware of the press.
Yes.
You were very aware of the media.
Right.
At what point in time did you understand that the media could be, I guess, useful to you?
From the very beginning. And the reality is, I knew as mayor it was critical that I communicate myself.
Yeah.
Because I was a mayor who had a different agenda than was the regular thinking in the city. Maybe 75 to 80% of the press that covered me looked at the world differently than I did.
So you had to sell.
So I always wanted the opportunity, like we're doing right now, to explain myself